In this video, we're going to be talking about what it's like investing in the Marines, so stay tuned. Hey, what is going on, Military Journeymen? Today, I've got my good friend David Pere. He's going to be helping educate us on what it's like investing in the Marines. So, David, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself, let the Military Journeyman community know who you are and what got you into real estate investing.
Yeah, so I'm Dave, and thank you for having me on the show first, Julian. I have been investing in real estate since 2015. Like you said, I've been in the Marine Corps for 11 years, so there was clearly a lot of time in there where I did what every service member does, I think, or too many of us. And I bought the Harleys and the sports cars and the rifles and the tattoos and had nothing to show for it. Plenty of booze and, protein powder and whatever else it is that we buy that we shouldn't. And then in 2015, I was reading the book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, the famous book. And I decided, I'm going to do this real estate thing. And I read a couple other books and I bought a duplex. I lived in one side, rented the other side. So I went from paying like right under $600 a month to live in an apartment to paying like $120 a month to own a house that had two sides. And then when I moved out, it started making me, $300 a month, which is not bad considering it only cost me like $3,000 to get into, because I did not use the VA loan, which is, I had a lender talk me out of it. So, as we get into the real estate world, the VA loan's awesome if you know what you're doing, and don't let lenders talk you out of it over stupid things like I did. So I got married to my wife. She had a house, but it didn't really cash flow. So we did some things to turn that around and make it actually make some money. And then I moved to Hawaii, and from there I bought a 10 unit. I bought a really large property too, but some stuff didn't really work out. So currently trying to sort that out through the legal system to get my money back out of it. And then, flipping a house right now. I've partnered on a couple flips in Hawaii. As we discussed, I've done some other, non-real estate investing, bought shares in a company before it went public, own portion of a mentor of mine's business, things like that. I generally don't do the individual stock market. I have a bunch of money in the TSP, which is a huge benefit, but I generally prefer to either be intimately familiar with the company or have a ownership interest in the company in order to dump my money into it. I like to be in control of my assets.
Now, with those 13 rental units that you have, how much is that cash flowing per month?
Yeah, obviously there's months that are a little better than others, but generally speaking, after all expenses are paid, it brings in about $1,500 a month. And then I mentioned the other things for single financing. We also have cattle on the 5 acres to kind of offset the cash flow from one of our rentals. And, we have almost 10 head of cattle now. And so they make, depending on how many cattle we hold back and all the technical jargon that goes into it, they make, another $5,000 to $7,000 a year ish, which is more than enough to pay the mortgage on that. So it's kind of a nice way to offset.
So 2015 is when you got started into real estate investing. That's a pretty big jump from going from not having any like education on home buying and just kind of doing the military thing, purchasing the nice vehicles. I always joke around about, one of the biggest things is like people come in and they get the Camaros, they get the Mustangs, they get the Jeep Wranglers, the Ford F-150s. So you were definitely in that crowd. But then in 2015, you decided to learn a little bit about real estate investing. How challenging was that, going from that previous mindset to now actually looking at like investing and purchasing a property?
It still bites me in the rear. I still have issues with, not to say that I grew up poor, right? I did not, but I did not grow up well off. And I grew up, with couponing and discounting and stuff. And I think part of me joining the military was like, hell yeah, I can buy name brand stuff now. And I still wrestle with like being at a store and telling myself, okay, well, why are you trying to spend $5 on something that's only $2 right here? It's the same thing. And so I still have the shiny syndrome and try to overspend on things that I don't need to. I'm a foodie, so I have to convince myself to eat in more often. But as far as the big things, the way that I've justified it, like for example, I had a nice S2000 that I turbocharged and done all this other fun stuff too. And, I basically rebuilt the engine and rebuilt it from the ground up in the garage and put a ton of money into it. Beautiful car. It was a fast car. It was a fun car, but it was a depreciating asset nonetheless. And the way that I convinced myself, like, hey, it's time to sell this thing, take that money and invest it, was essentially saying, hey, in 10 years, you'll be able to buy a much nicer car. So it's not that I have decided to live this super frugal lifestyle for the rest of eternity and I'm going to just forgo niceties. It's that I said, man, this is holding me back. But if I sell this now, then 10 20 years from now I can buy I don't know, whatever, insert favorite car here, and I'll be able to justify that because my assets will be paying for it. So theoretically that's the case. And I mean, when I sold that car, I dumped the money into an investment that is now earning me money faster than the car was depreciating. So I think so far it's worked out.
So being in the Marines, I don't know what the culture's like for investing or for people that are purchasing houses. What does a typical Marine think of, like, real estate investing, or those major life purchases like homes?
One of my difficult struggles as of late has been trying to figure out how to brand to where I reach the average Marine. The people that I'm reaching are the people who have had the epiphany moment and said, oh man, I need to get into real estate investing. And then they find my site or they find my podcast. And then that's great. We can help them. We can, there's actually quite a lot of those people out there. In fact, yesterday I was sitting in the bathroom, like I was washing my hands, and somebody walked up and was like, hey, I have a house that's worth this much, doing this, doing this, doing this. Should I refinance? Yada, yada. And we had like this full conversation. And it's just kind of funny how that has slowly transpired. But it's not a Lance Corporal asking me that, right? It's much further along in life individuals who have realized that. And so I'm trying to figure out, how do I reach, like, what would have resonated with me as a 19-year-old? Because I mean, I was just blowing my money. And I was a fairly, like, I understood the concept of like saving money. It wasn't that I just didn't know anything. It was just that I didn't care and I didn't understand about opportunity cost. So trying to find that balance and reach those people has been difficult. The overall culture, I think, for young Marines, even though we're not necessarily deploying to combat zones as much anymore, is essentially, I've basically boiled it down all the way to, I might die, so I'm going to buy some nice toys. Is really what I kind of like. If you go all the way back into the needs and motivators, I think that's basically what it boils down to, is like, I'm a type A. I joined the Marine Corps, so I want to show off how awesome I am, and I might die, so screw it. And that's, I mean, the Mustangs and the Camaros. I was a command financial specialist at my last unit, and I saw some pretty ridiculous, like, oops, I shouldn't have done that. And yeah, that culture is alive and well.
So what is it like investing in the Marines, as far as the because with Marines, I'm sure that every job has kind of like a different type of work life and style, deployments and stuff like that. But in general, is investing in the Marines something that is doable? Is it something that is like, are you able to receive BAH? Are you moving around too much? Do you have to go on a lot of deployments? What is that like?
A lot of that's job dependent. So if we don't generally, there are exceptions, but unless you're married, you're not going to get the housing allowance until you're an E6 generally. Obviously I've seen sergeants and I've seen corporals get it based on billeting requirements, but that's few and far between. The deployment cycle, that's really going to depend on your job. I know Marines who essentially work two almost full-time jobs, right? Like they Uber or they Domino's or they whatever, and they do it quite a lot and they make good money doing it. I also know Marines who are gone all the time and could just never make that happen, right? So it just kind of depends on your unit. If you're in the combat, like the ground combat element, so the infantry guys, the artillery guys, and all that, you're going to be out training a lot. It's going to make things a little bit more complicated. But on the flip side, you're going to be out training a lot, which means that you're going to have the opportunity to save a ton more money. You're going to have to, you're essentially, you're going to have to intentionally blow all your money to blow all your money, right? Because if you're gone for 3 weeks and you come back and blow 3 weeks worth of paychecks, well, that was pretty intentional. Whereas if you're just not good at budgeting and you're here all the time, it's very easy to rack that up. So there's a yin and yang there. As far as investing in the Marines, I joke with people all the time, but when you join the military, you essentially gain what they call level one financial freedom immediately. All of a sudden, all your bills are paid. If you had debt prior to the Marine Corps, your interest rate got cut to 6% due to the service universally fact. Some of it may have gotten, completely erased. They may have just said, "Oh, hey, we're going to forgive this." Um, you as a single guy, you're living eating at the chow hall, living in the barracks, like your expenses are nil, right? Except for maybe a vehicle that you chose to buy. And if you're married, you're getting housing allowance, you're getting food allowance, which a lot of people can't live on the 380 a month, but I have a family of four and we do it. So I don't know, choices. And we're not super frugal in the grocery store either. I like my Oreos and whatnot. So, we're not scrounging. The problem is that you get in the military and you're like, oh man, look at all this stuff I can buy with all this money I made. And then you go and you dig yourself a hole by buying things that on financing. And all of a sudden now, instead of bringing in $800 a month to save, you're bringing in 750, and then you're bringing in 700, and then you're bringing in 650 because you're handcuffing yourself with debt. And there's good debt out there. I'm all for using debt, but not in that way. So investing in the military, I think the biggest thing I would say for like the first few years is just focus on saving as much money as you can and learn about investments and network. And that's the piece that I missed, right? Like my TSP is doing fine now, but if I had known what I did or what I do now back when I joined, I did the math the other day, and just if I had just moved the money into the same fund I have now and done even half of what I'm investing right now, I would have over $20,000 more in the TSP. And that would have been super doable. I mean, I could have probably put in 3 times what I'm putting in right now and still been totally fine, especially through deployment. But,
And which fund is that?
So I am currently I do 75% C fund and 25% S fund, which is not 100% accurate, but fairly closely reflects what the Vanguard, the VTSAX total index fund does, which really any total index or total stock market index fund. And I'm just kind of a fan of that idea because it's basically saying, hey, I'm investing in the entire U.S. economy. So if the economy goes up, I win. And if the economy goes down, I lose. Well, I would like to think that our economy as a whole will do well. So instead of targeting specific stocks, I'm just saying, hey, I think our economy is going to do well. And I'm a fan of that.
So in the Marines, what is it like? Because you briefly mentioned that for unless you're an E6, you're not going to be receiving BH unless you're married. So how does that work with like bases and coming into the Marines and receiving, like, let's say BH?
Really, it's just you're going to be on the barracks, for the first few years for the most part, which honestly, everybody complains about that. But I think that's a really solid benefit because it means that your expenses are essentially nothing. So you might not get the housing allowance, but too many people go over their head with the housing allowance anyway. So it's probably a good thing as a young service member to be able to just, you live in the barracks for free and then live in the chow hall for free and you just save all this money.
I imagine that it might be a little bit complicated though, because like if you're not able to be in a position where you can learn maybe about house hacking, like in the Coast Guard, for example, like as an E3, I had to figure out right out of boot camp. Like as soon as I left boot camp, I have to figure out housing. So I had to, I wanted to save my BH because that was like extra income. So I had to house hack by living with, a roommate. How does that work with Marines? Because if you're going to be staying in the barracks for a longer period of time, does that just kind of like delay the progress of maybe learning about real estate?
Man, that's awesome. Yeah, I think that would be, I would definitely enjoy that opportunity. Yeah, I think, really, yeah, you're right. Podcast, books, and getting out and talking to people is probably the best way to. Now, granted, you can still buy a house, right? Like, there's nothing saying you couldn't buy a house in the area, and you could probably still house hack depending on your market, but you wouldn't have the housing allowance, so it wouldn't be as lucrative because you wouldn't be saving all of your housing allowance. I guess that's probably, I don't want to say disadvantage because I think, the first few years in the Marine Corps, it's probably a good idea to focus on learning your job and then to focus on learning. Because I think you might be a rare breed who actually figured out like, oh man, I can do this, this, and this and save some money. I wouldn't have done that at that age. I would have thought like, yeah, let's get some roommates and then we can have bigger parties. And that would have been, I think that's probably some of the logic behind why the Marine Corps does it this way is Marines have a reputation for probably getting a little too wild on the weekends. So I don't know if they would want us to all live in a house off base.
But if you are coming into the Marines, let's say you are married, are you going to be receiving BH right away, or do they usually put married people into government housing?
No, you'll get BAH right away, and you can choose to live on base housing, which depending on where you're at, I mean, base housing is wonderful. In Hawaii, you know, I was right next to work, and I was able to live in a much nicer place than I would have been able to afford out in town. But in Missouri, I would have told them like, hey, base housing is great, but I can save a ton of money by buying this place right over here. So I think that there's definitely an advantage there. But if you're, yeah, I mean, you get the housing allowance option right away. Oh, and I didn't even mention this, but like lieutenants, right? So as soon as an officer commissions or whatever, they instantly get the housing allowance. So I know I always tell single lieutenants, like, man, if I was you, I would do exactly what you said: buy a house and have 4 people living in it for with me as roommates, and then they're paying X, Y, Z and saving money on their housing allowance, and I'm reaping the benefits of having all these roommates.
Now, kind of going off of that, would you say it's easier to invest as an enlisted person or as an officer?
Ooh, I would like to say that it doesn't matter and it's a mentality thing, but you can get started at an earlier age with the housing allowance. So on the real estate side as an officer, because you're going to get housing allowance. So if you want to live off base and house hack, you can do that right away. And let's not pretend that we make equal amounts of pay. The officer is going to make more money. And so as long as they are intelligent with their finances, definitely easier to start on the officer side. That being said, you have to be intelligent with your finances. And I have had many a conversation with gentlemen who make substantially more than I do on the income column and make substantially more than I do on the expense column. And I end up taking home more than they do.
So what are some of the tips for enlisted Marines that are coming in that aren't going to be receiving BH? So they maybe have to be a little bit more creative with the limited income that they are receiving just from their basic pay.
Don't spend all your money on stupid crap. So the number one investment you can make is in yourself, right? Super cliche, but people say it. So if you spend $20 on a book, which I recommend Rich Dad Poor Dad as maybe your first book, because that's just a great book and has changed so many people's lives. If you spend $20 a month on a book, and I spend way more than $20 a month on books, but you can, and that could be an Audible book. I'm a huge fan of just listening to books while I commute to work. But you spend $20 a month on a book, and that's going to pay dividends, because if you're learning something new every month, you're going to it's like an exponential growth thing. Whereas if you spend the $20 on beer and you postpone the book, you're just the opportunity cost, like what you're missing out on is huge. And I wish I'd known that piece. So I would say the first few years you're the military, you should really knuckle down on the TSP and on saving. So I have a little ebook out on this, which this isn't a plug, but I basically wrote this book with the concept that if you were to just focus on your TSP for 4 years, just learn everything you could, network with people, ask questions, but really knuckle down on your TSP. The numbers show that depending on what fund you're in, you could theoretically dump a solid chunk of money into that in your first 4 years. And if you never touched it again, ever, it would be enough money for you to retire on when you hit 60, as long as you left it alone. Like if you had done everything that I didn't do, shoot, I would have, almost double what I have in it right now. And I would have another 30 years for it to compound. And if I had had that in the right fund, it would easily double 3 or 4 times again from now. And it would be at least a $1,500, if not $2,000 a month if I only pulled 4% out every month, which is like the safe withdrawal. So I would say focus on that. And I didn't mention it earlier. I have some money in the S&C funds, but if you don't understand the fund piece and you're not like a stock savvy guy, just put your money in the life cycle fund for the year you plan on retiring and just never touch it again, right? They'll automatically tweak it to be a little bit more aggressive when you're young and you can afford to lose some money, and then slowly move to conservative as you get older so you don't risk losing it all. And you can do that and just never touch it again. Like I have to take a look at mine every few months. But if you were to do that, you could just leave it. And that's much more passive. So I would say do that. But savings gap. So cut your expenses. I would say if you live right next to work, don't even buy the car, right? Buy a bicycle or carpool with friends. I mean, if you're only going to leave the barracks once or twice a week, the Uber is probably cheaper than the car payment. I mean, you think a $200 car payment, which, let's be realistic, most service members have a bigger car payment than that. You think a $200 car payment, the average Uber trip will say is $20, depending on where you're at and how far you're going. I mean, you could take an Uber like 2 or 3 times a week and it wouldn't even pay for the car payment, let alone the insurance, the gas, and everything else. So people have this pride, but and the other thing is you could have a roommate or a buddy who probably bought that really fancy car, and you could just pay them $5 or $10 for gas and ride with them for even cheaper than Uber. So I mean, there's so many expenses. You could literally live without a single penny out of pocket. You could save your entire paycheck, and if you ate at the chow hall and lived in the barracks, and you could save every penny you make, and you could. I know guys on the enlisted side. I know guys on the officer side who blew this out of the water, but I know guys on the enlisted side who saved $50,000, $100,000 in their first 4 years. And now their TSP is worth, 2 or 3 times what mine is. And they have a huge real estate portfolio because they had $50,000 sitting in a bank account, $50,000 sitting in TSP. And they were like, okay, great. I'm ready to buy some real estate. And that's just super cool to think that that's where I could have been in my first 4 years. I mean, I could have been more than that because I had the deployment, but instead I had a Harley and a car and a whole bunch of stories, which the stories are great, but.
And speaking of stories, jobs in the Marines. I know every service probably has jobs that you want to. If you are coming into the Marines, like let's say you want to serve, but you also are wants to get into investing and do some type of investing like that. There's probably some jobs that you might want to stay away from, and some jobs that are maybe more optimal. So, what would those jobs be? Like if you could go back and choose something that would best suit for like optimal performance, doing kind of the investing side, what would that be?
All the boring ones. I mean, the jobs like administration, legal, food service. Most of those jobs are going to have set hours. Another good one, and there's actually, these are 2 that are probably not quite as boring, but one would be crash fire rescue, which is basically like our firefighters. Now, that's not an easy one to get into, but they work, your typical, I think they do 24 on, 24 off, 24 on, 48 off. They either do 24-hour shifts or 12-hour shifts, but they do set schedules, time on, time off, time on, time off. And then, so like a firefighter, which is great, you got a day at work and then a day or 2 where you can focus on your investing and your learning. The military police is the same thing, as well as our brig guys. They have a 24-hour shift, and then they have 12 off, or 24-hour shift, and then, like 1 day on, 1 day off, 1 day on, 2 days off, whatever. And so they have a set schedule laid out, and they know, okay, I can do X, Y, Z. And then the aviation side has some jobs where you can get night crew, which a lot of people, working graveyard would suck. But if you're working night crew, you can have the entire day to focus on investing and networking. Jobs you want to stay away from are the jobs that actually, ironically, the jobs that would get paid more, right? You'd make a little bit extra money if you're in the field the whole time. You would make a little bit extra money if you're in special forces or in recon or in anything that gets the jump button. If you speak a language, you get a little bit of an extra paycheck. But if you are jump school, dive school, combat pay, any of these courses, and you make a little bit extra money, you're going to be gone all the time. So the amount of time you're going to have to learn as an infantry guy is going to be much less than the amount of time you'd have to learn as an admin guy who's in his barracks all the time. So it's kind of a, give and take. You might make a little bit extra money, you might save a little bit extra money, but you're also your quality of life will not necessarily be there. Now, that being said, a large chunk of people who join the Marine Corps, they join because they want to kick indoors and shoot bad guys. So they don't really care about being the admin guy who has a little bit of extra time to invest. So just take the extra money you make and bring books with you in your training. Don't marry because you're infatuated. Like, think logically through the process. Your spouse needs to be beneficial to you. It's a financial decision as well. So marry intelligently. But assuming your spouse is also frugal and not blowing your entire paycheck while you're deployed, I mean, you can come home with, 6 figures in your pocket.